So I'm going to start thinking about asking you guys about the paradigm of how the fashion industry works. And, oh, I'm sorry, I just forgot so coming from technology, when I'm getting to know the fashion industry from the back end, I was surprised to really find out that fashion industry doesn't own the means to its own production. And what I mean by that, technology companies are always doing R&D. They're planning 5 and 10 years out. Intel's making chips, Google's making software. They're acquiring businesses that they need to get them to the next step. And fashion companies, large brands, don't have internal R&D. They don't have a history. And so when we're kind of in this space, and we have now basically people from a huge global brand and someone from a tiny startup, I mean, in comparison, tiny, how do we actually get you guys to work together? How do you come to the center? What do you need from them? What do they need from you? And what I always get asked is, why isn't this happening faster? So let's start there. So case study between Vinnova and H&M.
Very open question. So, well, you're perfectly right in that is how the fashion industry looks like today. And I mean, we've been in this business since 1947, and we've always worked together with suppliers. I think one key to success there has been that we have really worked closely with them and grown relationships throughout the years. And together we have actually innovated and helped to develop both their business as well as ours. And I think that is exactly what's going to be needed also in the future. I mean, I would really foresee like an ecosystem of all those different players working together, adding each one's unique competence to the table. So I think from an H&M perspective, what we have is the size and scale, and the fact that we really want to make sustainability something that's affordable for everyone, not something you can buy only if you have a lot of money, for example. So I think that size and scale is something that we can help to utilize and really fast forward some of the innovations that we see now emerging.
Okay. And
yeah, we have not been inside the textile industry at all, so hard to say. But how we are working is that we really would like to work together with the brand owners, because you have all the power, you have all the vision that where to go, you know, all the expertise. Maybe one good example what is now created inside Europe is Fashion for Good. Maybe you have heard about that. We are applying in that upscaling program. And I think the idea is quite interesting, that because now the different brand owners are coming together, and then they are thinking together that how they can help these kind of tiny companies when we are in the middle of upscaling. Mm. And of course there are many different needs. You need resources, you need expertise, competence, raw materials, testing, customer trials, you name it. Mm. But I can say that we are open.
But if I can just add to that, because I think that's a really great example. I mean, that's the Fashion for Good is done by the Zeighami Foundation, and we have a similar initiative called the Global Change Award. So award winners, they get to share money to develop their own ideas and so on. But what they also get, which they also provide, is the access to the industry. So many of those innovators don't actually know how will this material, this innovation play out in a supply chain. They've only tested in a lab, for example. So I think getting that access to that real life experience, being in a factory, testing to see what the machines actually look like, that's invaluable in that sense.
Great, yeah. And getting scientists to talk to fashion designers, it's a language question. Great. So, and then let's continue that with you, Carole, in terms of thinking about, what is needed for the education system for the industry to transition. And you mentioned that, your designers are now kind of thinking and working like biologists. How does this change curriculum? How does this change the systems? I mean, oftentimes, fashion schools are on their own. They're not part of other universities with research, et cetera. So what does the next generation of fashion designers and fashion professionals look like?
I think we talked a bit about that last night. I think what is really the challenge for us in education is that we still have to teach the very traditional, tailoring, the very traditional, understanding the way you actually create garments. But we also need to introduce designers to new technologies like biotechnologies, like AI, like wearable electronics. And so we're having to teach more and more. We're having to pack the curriculum with a lot of new alternatives. So that's the challenge in terms of how do we place that into a curriculum. And I think what's interesting in my role with LVMH is really to look at across the disciplines, so working with architecture, graphic design, product design, fashion. And I think what is really exciting is that actually if you look at how architecture or how an architect students will embed sustainability or develop new proposals for sustainability will be very different to someone in fashion. But one of the things that's really interesting and that we need to create more of is learning from other disciplines. And so one of the things I did this year was organize a symposium looking at biodesign and biofabrication, but across architecture, product, fashion, textiles. So that we actually can learn how other people develop these principles and how they're embedded in different industries. Because I think the fashion system is changing. I mean, you know, we saw an incredible, impressive example of, you know, AI to actually, AI, but also to look at virtual reality to design clothing. And that gives live, real-time live information about sustainability. So I think we have brands now engaging with technology. We have brands really collaborating with consultancy. We used to have fashions going to, you know, Première Vision, sourcing their fabrics, talking to the suppliers. Now it's way beyond that. I mean, now it's actually really looking for these other kind of skill sets that actually can be brought in a company. That's what we're doing in education. What else do we need to actually incorporate to make sure our designers across the board are aware of the landscape of sustainability? Because it's never black and white, as we know. And so we don't, you know, when we assess students on sustainability, and not all courses assess on sustainability, that's one of my challenges. I want to make sure everybody assesses on sustainability. But how do you do that? You know, because when you're not in a sort of manufacturing system with a supply chain, how do you assess what is sustainable or not sustainable? So the way we've done it with the Textile Futures Master's program, which is now called Material Futures, is actually asking students, there's a viva, and they have to discuss their project in the context of sustainability, which means they have to showcase their understanding, their appreciation of where the downfalls are of the project. So I think one of the main challenges is, hey, how do we assess sustainability in fashion? But also, how do we pack the curriculum with all these new options which are there and which they should know about?
Right.
I think on that note, I can say that we see that AI it's imperative for us to create this ecosystem, and we're collaborating a lot with universities. And one point is actually your background. MIT is a perfect interdisciplinary, you know, example, and that is
Except no fashion school.
No.
Everything but art, architecture. Yeah.
Try to learn from that and try to create similar kind of environment for the fashion industry, the AI, the tech side, university, industry, small startups, big companies, to create this ecosystem.
Right. So we're all here because we're optimistic about the future. We're talking about these innovations and kind of what things are going to turn into. But I want to just flip it around for a second and talk about the perils of all the technology that's being developed. And what are you guys most afraid about, either from the perspective of what's going to happen to AI, changing relationships with human, privacy, et cetera, through to biotech. You know, so let's talk about the flip side of things and, you know, kind of be candid about it. Anybody? What are you worried about?
Well,
yeah, please. Yeah.
Area where that we're looking at right now, and we're not saying that we're got far ahead on that yet, but this is very much on our radar, is actually the ethical side.
Yes.
And I think it's imperative to have that in mindset. Sustainability is not only about the environment, but also about the human and the persons. And, you know, do we utilize AI and pushing, you know, pink unicorn T-shirts to 4-year-old girls, and want to push that or not? Looking at the bias of the data and exploring that, I think that's a very important part, and this is a responsibility from our side to take a look at that and make sure that we don't have this biased data and we don't push people towards certain areas only, and then they become, and then there's a circularity in that only.
Well, I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid point from Arti's side. I think on top of that, what I would see as one of the biggest worries is that, I mean, when you're in a conference like this or wherever you go, you see all those great examples of the things that are happening. So much of that is happening in isolation. And I think there's so much potential out there, and there's a risk that we're not harnessing that because we can't really get those forums or those platforms to make all of that happen together. So, I mean, I think as you were saying before, there are a lot of different innovators that today are operating in the same field. So how do you make sure that they complement each other and not compete against each other, and what role can we play in sort of making that happen? So not really harnessing all that potential, I think, is what I'm afraid of, because the creativity is out there, the ingenuity is out there, and the innovation is out there. So it's really about sort of putting it all together.
Right, yeah. Do any of you think that sort of governments or some kind of policy can play a role in determining these ethics, or do you think it should come internally from companies, large, small, or universities?
I think governance, what they can do is like, for instance, that we have all this regulation about data, and that's a minimum level of compliance that they can ensure. But I think the responsibility lies on the companies and the people that are behind, because we're people as well. So it relies on us to take action and to be more, have the moral compass, be more ethical,
right.
Be more sustainable.
And the transparency thing, yeah.
I think we need more regulation to move to circular. I mean, I think we shouldn't have anybody dumping anything in landfills. I mean, it's just shocking. Why is it still happening?
Right.
So I think we need to have a change in regulation, and also we have to stop dumping our waste in other countries. We have to deal with our own waste, because that's unethical. I know that China recently has sort of had issues with taking UK kind of waste, and like, but of course, why would they take our dump? I mean, it's up to us to deal with our waste in a way that's appropriate, circular, and simply just dealing with local waste. If that was better regulated, would close the loop in terms of the circular chain much faster. And if there was more investment, and I'll target the UK government specifically here, in looking to moving towards more circular, sustainable models of manufacturing to support the likes of Vinnova or the likes of, coming up with absolutely brilliant ways of doing, but, financially, how do you support this? And I think for me, it's not just the regulation, it's having more people investing in the right kinds of technologies, and having brands, and you're doing brilliantly with the Global Change Award, is investing in people really looking at new ways of doing things. LVMH is investing in us to make sure the next generation is eco-literate. We need more brands to actually invest in education, in innovation, to make sure that happens quicker. My fear is that we don't transition fast enough. We have seen it, you've showed, we're already consuming more than one planet. We're exploding our world population and consumption. And my fear is that, yes, it's much better than 20 years ago, but I'm not sure it's fast enough. So I think that's my fear.
Yeah, and I think you kind of led very easily into my last question, because we have to wrap up somewhat soon. But so thinking about media and education of the consumer, right? So we're all inside, internal industry insiders, and there's a lot of hype that goes on in the media about these, processes that are going to change the world around this stuff. But also there's, scandals, and the Rana Plaza, these kinds of things that are happening, and the dangers of fast fashion, et cetera. And so how can we actually start to educate consumers in a responsible way? What is the role of giant, global companies like H&M, with great power comes great responsibility, versus kind of understanding the science of what you do, and getting people to that place. And also, does it matter if consumers know and care about this process of sustainable design and development?
That's a big final question.
Yeah, okay, 2 minutes. Yeah.
But I mean, just so coming back to the first part of that, I mean, I think that ultimately the big problem with the industry is the lack of trust. And because of that, people want to find very simple answers to really complex questions. Yes. So I think that the answer to that really comes back to your presentation at the beginning. It's about transparency, making sure that we are really open about how this industry works, what is really good, what is really challenging, and how can we work together to further improve what's good and really combat the challenges. And here I think that we're taking a lot of important steps towards that transparency and, of course, enabling that. And ultimately, that would also help the consumers. I mean, we can see from our research that some consumers are really interested and want to dig deep, but they're quite few. Most of them just want to feel that, when you buy something, you contribute to something good. So I think it's about catering for the needs of all those customers. Right. But in the end of the day, it really is about transparency and showcasing what the industry is really about.
I'm not sure we should educate a consumer, because, I mean, sustainability is a headache for us who are very informed, and that's our day-to-day job. How can you expect a consumer to make a choice between a recycled polyester and a BCI cotton? how would they know? And I think it's our job to make sure that what we put on the shelves in the first place is not damaging the planet. So I think there's a way to go, and I think, you know, there's a transition to happen, but I don't think we can educate the consumer to know that. It's hard enough for us to know what are the right choices. It's just, I don't think it's the right solution.
But I think that with the big companies are coming together and working together with the small startups like we are, we think and we believe and we are 100% sure that it is really sustainable choice. And then it is much more easier to make it public, make it open, have a good discussion, trying to explain that what we are doing, why it is so sustainable. I think it is only way to go, that you have to be as open as possible. And that's what we try to do.
Yeah, for almost like what Anna said, for the consumers that do care. And I think also the flip side, and I agree with you, Carole, that the biggest win is the consumer that doesn't care about your product being sustainable, but they buy it anyways because it's the best product on the market at the best price point.
Well, I think all customers want to feel that they're part of a solution, not part of a problem. And I think it's that convenience that we need to make, basically make accessible to them.
Yeah.
But I think what could be worse is, you know, there's a real confusion out there still that what is natural is ecological.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not. But, you know, you could have consumers thinking, well, you know, this is cotton, it's natural, surely it's better than polyester, but actually not necessarily, depending on how it's been produced. So that's why we can't rely on a consumer to have that knowledge, because they could make the wrong choices and therefore impact on the actual demand and therefore push a brand to produce more of something that's maybe not so.
Yeah, that's really complicated, especially things like with synthetic biology, people think that it's made of bacteria and then they get worried about their health. So the miseducation is it's just as bad. So with that, I need to wrap up, but there's so much more. We're almost going into lunch, so hopefully we can continue this discussion and take questions later. But thanks so much for everyone's talk and your discussion.